Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the historic Stranahan House Museum. My name is Jonathan Axler, and I'm one of the historians here at the Stranahan House. Today is the first of what's going to be our Friday History Hour lecture series, where we'll be talking about not only Stranahan topics, but also a variety of Florida history topics as well. Now, we are testing. This is a new program for us, so I do apologize if there's a little bit of a lag during this program. Again, we are trying some new technical ways to bring this program about. We've been testing, and hopefully it will come out pretty well today. We'll see. But like I said, this lecture series, we're going to be doing a variety of topics, and when we were deciding what our first program should be, we of course thought, well, we should probably talk about Frank and Ivy Stranahan. After all, they're the individuals who lived at the historic Stranahan House Museum, which, for those who do not know, is the most historic property, not only in downtown Fort Lauderdale, but also in all of Broward County. The house was built in 1901. And Frank and Ivy Stranahan, they are considered the founding father and mother of Fort Lauderdale, and they arrived in Fort Lauderdale in the 1890s. But here's the thing, though. The name Fort Lauderdale predates Frank and Ivy Stranahan. It actually goes back to the 1830s. In the 1830s, there was actually a fort here in what was now Fort Lauderdale. In fact, there were 3 forts. And these forts tie into a oftentimes little known but very important conflict in Florida history and really American history. They were called the Seminole Wars. There were also 3 Seminole Wars. They were a series of conflicts fought between the United States and the Seminole tribe. And as you will come to learn, these conflicts played an extremely important role in the foundation of this state, and in many ways the foundation of what is Fort Lauderdale today. So our first program is called the Seminole Wars in Fort Lauderdale. We will talk about really what Fort Lauderdale's role was during this military conflict. Now, you're probably wondering what I'm wearing at the moment. I got a kind of a funny hat on and a nice wool uniform. Well, this is the kind of uniform that Army soldiers serving during the Seminole War and serving at Fort Lauderdale would have worn. This is an artilleryman's uniform. You can tell by the yellow neck here. It also has a sky blue uniform and my nice little 1830s forage cap. So yeah, unlike modern day soldiers who wear helmets, soldiers back then did not. They wore these forage caps, which they could use not only to protect their heads, but also to carry supplies with them too. So that's why it's called foraging. You could put food in it. But anyways, with that being said, why don't we begin our program? All right. So the Seminole Wars in Fort Lauderdale. Now, to understand the Seminole Wars, you got to kind of understand a little bit about the origins of this conflict. And to understand the origins of this conflict, you have to understand sort of a little bit of the history of Fort Lauderdale Florida prior to it becoming a U.S. territory. So Florida, of course, had human beings living in it for tens of thousands of years. The first inhabitants of Florida were, of course, our Native Americans. Hundreds of Native American tribes lived in Florida. These tribes included the Calusa, the Temecula, the Apalachee, Tocobawa, Jaega, and of course, Miami and Fort Lauderdale's very own tribe, the Tequesta. And these tribes lived, again, for thousands of years in Florida. But their lives were going to change when the Spanish and other European explorers entered Florida in the 1500s. The Spanish were the ones that would claim Florida as their own. It would become a Spanish territory. The Spanish would not settle most of Florida. They pretty much kept to what is now modern-day St. Augustine, which of course is the United States' oldest continuous city, as well as Pensacola. Now, unfortunately for these original indigenous tribes, a lot of them would go extinct, mostly due to conflict, as well as disease being the big one, as well as slavery. And in fact, by the mid-1700s, these tribes, again, were all but gone from Florida. Now, when that happened, the land basically opened up for settlement. And the Spanish, again, never tried to settle much of Florida, but other Native American tribes would. Tribes all throughout the southeastern United States, tribes like the Creeks, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, Cherokee, Yamasee, amongst others, would come down to Florida, at least certain members would. And they would settle all throughout northern Florida, building farms, ranches, and other types of settlements. Now, these Native American settlers would eventually get a name, and since most of them were of Creek origin, they were given a Creek name called Seminole or Seminole. The word means basically outcast, runaway, or even frontiersman or settler. There's different meanings to the name Seminole, so it's kind of an interesting name. And a lot of these different tribal groups, they would intermarry, they would join up, and soon a new tribe was going to be born. So the Seminoles are a very unique tribe in the fact that we know exactly when they were created, and kind of the way they were created is, again, very unique when it comes to Native American tribes. Now, the Seminoles, for the most part, would get along pretty well with the Spanish, and then when the British took over Florida in 1763, they would basically capture it from the Spanish. The Seminoles also got along pretty well with the British government. But one group that the Seminoles did not get along with pretty well were American colonists, particularly American colonists in Georgia and the Carolinas. Conflicts would erupt between the two groups because both groups were kind of competing for the same land. A lot of American colonists wanted to settle Florida, but the Seminoles were not too keen on this. And in fact, during the American Revolution, the Seminoles would actually ally themselves with the British. Now, of course, the Americans would win the American Revolution, and they, of course, would remember this. And this would, of course, cause further tension between the two groups. Now, luckily for the Seminoles, this conflict was going to be postponed because after the Revolution, Florida would go back to being a Spanish territory. Now, another reason why the American colonists, or I should say now American citizens, were not too fond of the Seminoles was because another group was coming into Florida, and that were runaway African American slaves. Yeah, a lot of people, when we think of the Underground Railroad, we generally think of it as being they're all trying to escape up north to the northern states or Canada. But in the early 19th century, Florida was actually a much more popular destination. It was, after all, much more closer to the southern states. It was Spanish territory, so slave catchers couldn't go into that territory legally. And also, Florida was very rugged. It was mostly wilderness, Everglades, and swamps. And plus, the Seminoles themselves were more than happy to kind of bring these runaways in. Now, these runaways and the Seminoles had a kind of an indentured servant, feudal kind of relationship. The runaways would work for the Seminoles, oftentimes on their own farms, but the Seminoles would provide them protection. And as time would go on, many of these runaway slaves would actually become incorporated into the Seminoles themselves. And if you see in the image to the right, you'll see that many of these former slaves would adopt Seminole customs and garbs, and today they're known as the Black Seminoles. So, as you can imagine, now imagine yourself again as an American citizen living in Georgia, the Carolinas. You have a tribe that's, somewhat hostile. And if you're a plantation owner, you're also losing your slaves. So as you can imagine, many Americans in the South were very eager to see the Seminoles taken care of. And this would lead to what would become the first of the Seminole Wars. Now, the first Seminole War was fought in the from 1817 to 1818. Personally, I feel like the war was a little bit longer than that, lasting to the 1820s, but that 1817, 1818 was sort of the focus of the conflict. And you'll see that the war was pretty much entirely fought in the Florida Panhandle. That's where most of the Seminoles were living at this time. Now, the U.S. government, when they decide that they want to fight the Seminoles, they send their top general and really their top Indian fighter, which was Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a Tennessee man who only a few years earlier had made a name for himself for beating the British at the Battle of New Orleans, as well as defeating the Creek Indians in the Creek Wars, most famously at Horseshoe Bend. So Jackson takes an army with him south into Florida, essentially invading Spanish Florida, because remember, this is Spanish territory, and he launches attacks against a variety of Seminole villages, as well as free black Seminole settlements as well, most notably at the Battle of Fort Gadsden, which was very tragic. It was a free slave settlement, which almost all the inhabitants were killed when their armory blew up due to an American cannon ship ball. But nevertheless, Jackson was able to defeat the Seminoles in most of the battles, but Jackson decided to take it a little bit further. Jackson felt that the Seminole issue was never going to be solved as long as Spain still controlled Florida. So Jackson would march his army to Pensacola, which was the capital of West Florida at that time. And he actually captures the city, and this almost causes a war between the United States and Spain. Luckily, though, for the United States, the Spanish were still licking their wounds from the Napoleonic Wars. They also were fighting massive rebellions all throughout Latin America, Mexico, Central America, and South America. And Florida, again, was never seen as a particularly valuable colony for them. So they decided to negotiate, and in 1819, the Spanish and U.S. government signed the Adams-Otis Treaty, which officially gave Florida to the United States. So yeah, the Seminole Wars are responsible for why Florida became a U.S. territory. And it would officially become a U.S. territory in 1821. That's when the official handover happened. Now, what about the Seminoles themselves? Well, in 1823, they would sign a first of many treaties, the first one being the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. This treaty basically ended hostilities, and it basically required that the Seminoles move into a reservation. And as you look on this map, the reservation was essentially in central Florida. Remember, most of Florida's good land that we think of when it comes to farming or creating plantations were in northern Florida, particularly in the Panhandle and the St. Johns region, which is where Jacksonville is today. Central Florida was seen as too rugged, too much of a wilderness. So it was thought that this would be a fine territory for the Seminoles, and the U.S. settlers would live in the north. Seminoles agreed to it. They felt the land was not too bad. They felt like they could make it work. They also could still travel and trade. And for those who know, Florida is made up of many rivers that connect the state. And many of these Seminoles would actually travel very far south and sort of build unofficial settlements in southern Florida, which will come into play later in our story. So nevertheless, the conflict was over, and soon a large rush of settlement would begin with American settlers. And one of these settlements would actually take place on the New River. So even though most of the settlements were in northern Florida, some were traveling pretty far south. And in 1823, a New River settlement was created. And again, the New River is the river that goes through Fort Lauderdale. So yeah, there was actually a settlement before the modern city. This early settlement would not be too big, but it would have about 70 people living in it by the 1830s. Now, what would bring people to the New River, which at this point was seen as Everglades and swamps? Well, for a couple of different industries. And these two industries were wrecking and coontie production. Now, these names are probably kind of funny. I'm sure a lot of you probably don't even know what that means, but don't worry, I will explain. First, let's talk a little bit about wrecking. So if you're somebody who maybe owns a boat or goes scuba diving or snorkeling, you know that Florida has a wide variety of beautiful coral reefs or little islands throughout the state, particularly in the southern part of the state. Now, today, these islands and coral reefs are not too bad. We have really nice maps, and we also have technology like sonar. and radar that keeps us from hitting them. But at those days in the 1800s, they didn't have that. So shipwrecks were a very, very common occurrence. So entrepreneurial individuals, they were legally allowed to actually salvage these ships, and they became known as wreckers. So they would go to shipwrecks, and if they saved the crew, they can actually acquire all of the merchandise that that ship had, and then they can resell it. Kind of a sketchy business in some ways, but it was legal, and it could be very profitable. In fact, if we look on the map, you'll see Key West is at the very bottom, and surprisingly enough, from the 1820s really up to about almost the turn of the century, 20th century, Key West was the most populous settlement in the state of Florida and the wealthiest. In fact, in the 1820s, Key West, in terms of per capita for a square mile, was the most wealthiest city in all of America, which beats out even cities like New York and Boston, which I think is pretty amazing. Now, of course, with Key West's success, a lot of these early South Florida communities, they wanted to become the next Key West. And so everybody was just trying to build settlements along the coastlines, and the New River settlement was one of them. But perhaps a more lucrative industry for early Fort Lauderdale, or I should say New River settlements, was coontie production. Now, coontie is a Seminole word for arrowroot. And arrowroot is a type of cycad, and it grows, and it is poisonous to eat. But if you are able to process it, particularly its roots, it can actually be turned into a type of starch, basically an alternative to flour. And the good thing about arrowroot flour is that it doesn't spoil like flour does. And this is very important if you live, let's say, in the southern states where things rot much quicker, or if you're out in sea where again, things can rot much more quickly. And also, wheat doesn't really grow naturally here in Florida or much of the South, so arrowroot was especially important for early Floridians. In fact, our own Frank Stranahan, even as late as the 1890s, was very interested in purchasing these types of plants. So even as early as the early 20th century, coontie was seen as a very valuable product. Now, in this early settlement, perhaps the most prominent individual was a man by the name of William Cooley. Now, William Cooley, and you can see the image of his homestead to the right, was a Baltimore man. He came to Florida in the 1820s once it became a territory, and he decided to come to the New River settlement around 1825, 1826. He built a homestead for himself. He grew mostly coontie, also did a little bit of wrecking, and he very quickly was kind of seen as the most respectable, most successful individual in this community. And he actually would even become the lawman or the justice of peace of the New River settlement. And Cooley also had relatively good ties with the Seminoles. He would even trade with them, and for the most part, again, got along very well. But unfortunately for Cooley and the New River settlement and really all of Florida, these brief moments of peace would be interrupted with violence again. And I will explain. So by the late 1820s, Florida, especially northern Florida, was starting to be pretty heavily settled. Many of the new Florida settlers, they wanted to start expanding again further south, and many of them were interested in the land that made up the Florida reservation, which again is like between what is now modern day Gainesville and modern day Orlando. Kind of gives you an idea where that land was. So many of them began pressuring the United States to perhaps move them. Also, the whole issue of runaway slaves had never been solved either. Even though Florida was now a U.S. territory, runaways were still escaping to the Seminole area, Seminole Reservation, where the Seminoles would protect them. So there was also that issue as well. And also, this wasn't just in Florida, too. A lot of the same kind of sentiment was going all throughout the United States, particularly in the southern states like Georgia and Tennessee, Alabama. So a lot of them were also pressuring that the native tribes there should be removed one way or another. Now, unfortunately for these Native American tribes, a champion for removal would become elected president of the United States, and that was the Seminoles' old enemy, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was elected president in 1828, and one of his big campaign promises was that he was going to remove eastern Native American tribes west of the Mississippi River. And in 1830, Jackson got his wish with the Indian Removal Act. Now, many of you might know of this act through the Cherokee Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee were moved to Oklahoma. And that's the image you see to the right. Oklahoma, then known as Indian Territory, was the land that was going to be designated for these eastern tribes. And if we look, Florida, the Seminoles, their little plot was going to be right here. So the Seminoles were designated for removal as well. So Jackson preferably wanted these removals to be done peacefully, would send negotiators to these different tribes, and this was no different with the Seminoles. So he sends negotiators. They begin discussing it with the Seminole chiefs and tribal elders for removal. Now, some Seminoles would agree to remove. They kind of felt like war with the United States was not in their best interest. They felt it would be a losing cause. But others were much more adamantly against this. And the man who is often seen as the leader of the anti-removal faction of the Seminoles was a young warrior who was not a chief, but he was considered a war leader by the name of William Powell, or as he's more famously known as, Osceola, his Seminole name. During the treaty negotiations, Osceola famously took out his knife and stabbed the document, stating that he would never leave and that the Seminoles would never leave Florida. Now, the negotiations would eventually conclude with the Treaty of Payne's Landing, a very controversial treaty because no minutes or records were really taken of the negotiations, and many of the Seminoles who signed the document said that they were forced to sign due to the pressure from the U.S. government. One of these individuals who would sign the document would become very important in our story. His name was Abiaka. Abiaka signed it, but he would later state that, again, he was forced to. But we'll talk a little bit more about Abiaka later in our program. This gives you an idea of what the removal was going to look like. Unlike the Cherokee who were living in Georgia and Tennessee having to march overland, the Seminoles would be forced to take boats. Most of them would leave from Tampa Bay. If you ever go to Tampa, I highly recommend you visit a place called Egmont Key. Egmont Key was an island right off the coast of Tampa, and this is where a lot of the Seminoles would be taken away from Florida to Oklahoma. And as you can see, the removal took place from a period from 1835 all the way up to 1858. Now, the treaty was signed in 1830. The Seminoles were given a few years to gather and leave, but by 1835 they were required to leave Florida. And it was at this point now that hostilities would begin. And the war began quite dramatically in December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1835. A large contingent of about 100 U.S. Army soldiers were marching from Fort King, which is today Ocala, to Tampa, Fort Brooke, which is now today known as Tampa. The column were mostly artillerymen, so kind of wearing the uniform I was wearing, and they would be ambushed by a large party of Seminole warriors. The Seminoles caught these soldiers off guard, and the soldiers would be pretty much killed to a man. Only 2 survivors from this battle. The battle became known as Dade's Massacre because their commander was a Major Francis Dade. And if that name sounds very familiar, well, it should be, because Dade County would be named after Francis Dade, who did not survive this battle. He was actually killed in the very first volley, but they would name Dade County after him. So this kicks off the war. And in case you're wondering about Osceola, he was not at this battle, but he would actually do his own mission by killing a man named Willie Thompson, who was an Indian agent at Fort King. He and Osceola did not get along very well. They had a very strong feud, and Osceola kind of ended the feud very violently when he assassinates him at the same time this battle was going on. Now, with war starting, it took a little bit of time for the New River settlement to hear about this attack. Remember, we didn't have phones back then. It was all by letter and horseback, and the New River settlement was pretty isolated. But unfortunately for the New River settlement, a very sad moment would take place about a week after that Dade battle. So before this attack, about a few months prior, William Cooley, who I mentioned was the justice of peace, the lawman, was involved in a pretty intense case. It had to do with the murder of a Seminole chief by the name of Alabama. Alabama was killed by a couple of white settlers, and Cooley does arrest the perpetrators of this murder, and he sends them to Key West, which is where the closest courthouse was. Now, these the defendants, they were allowed to go free because, according to the judge, and they felt that there was not enough evidence. Now, when the Seminoles heard about this, they, as you can imagine, were quite displeased. They felt that Cooley had withheld evidence, and that he's the reason why the murderers of Alabama were set free. So they now had a feud with William Cooley. Now, again, flash forward to January of 1836. Cooley and the men of the New River settlement did not know that war had started, so they had left the settlement to the Hillsborough Inlet to go on a wrecking mission to salvage a ship. When they did this, the settlement was left undefended, and a party of Seminoles would attack the Cooley homestead and sadly kill William Cooley's wife and children, as well as their teacher. So a very tragic moment. War is a horrible thing, and sadly sometimes innocence on both sides, because I will say that also a lot of Seminole women and children would be killed as well. So war is very horrible, and unfortunately for Cooley, he did lose his family. Cooley would survive, and he would leave the New River settlement, as did pretty much everybody else, because once the war began, nobody wanted to live here. So in 1836, the New River settlement came to an end. And that's why Fort Lauderdale doesn't consider this settlement its birth, because we're not connected to that settlement. And it's the reason why Cooley himself is not considered the founding father of Fort Lauderdale. So when we think of Fort Lauderdale, there were two separate settlements. There was the New River one and the much later Fort Lauderdale one. Cooley, just kind of give it a little epilogue for him, he would survive the war, and he would eventually move to Tampa and pass away in the 1860s. Now, as for the war itself, it was mostly fought in what we can consider, again, central Florida, particularly near the Ocala-Tampa area, that kind of land between it. You'll see that there was quite a few battles fought. I'm not going to go into these battles, but most of them were mostly Seminole victories. The Seminoles were actually doing pretty well for themselves in these early stages of the war. The Army was kind of fighting a traditional method, and the Seminoles were simply, who knew the land, knew the swamps, they would just kind of ambush these soldiers. The government, as you can imagine, was getting kind of frustrated with this, and they would replace quite a few generals. Some of these generals would later see fame in the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, probably most famous, which was General Scott. But he was not successful against the Seminole. So the Army decides to go with a new general by the name of Thomas Jessup. Jessup was the quartermaster general, which basically he was in charge of supply and inventory. So making sure all the soldiers are fed and equipped. Jessup was kind of seen as a very analytical man, and he decided that he was going to take a more analytical approach to how we would fight this, a much more not a direct approach. He wasn't going to try to fight the Seminoles, but he was going to try to quarantine them and try to starve them out. And the way he would do this was he was going to build a large series of forts all throughout the state, all throughout the Seminole territory. You can see these forts, they're the little brown symbols on the map. And again, they basically encircle that Seminole reservation. And he would build these forts in key locations like riverways or land that the Seminoles would use for farming, and try to disrupt the Seminoles' supply of food. As we all know, you can't fight without food. Napoleon himself would state that an army marches on its stomach. Now, in order to maintain these forts, Jessup was going to need a lot of soldiers. So he would call upon a large number of reinforcements. Today, we might term it as a troop surge. But then it was just a call of arms, call of reinforcements, and he would not only get Army regulars, which were the professional U.S. Army, but he would also ask for U.S. Marines and U.S. Navy sailors. Yeah, what's kind of interesting about the Second Seminole War, it's really the only war, Native American war in American history, where Marines and sailors would actually take part. Marines and sailors were not really used to fight Native Americans because most of those wars were fought inland, away from the ocean. But Florida, being a special case, would see Marines and sailors take part. But the vast majority of Jessup's command or reinforcements would come in the form of militia. Now, for those who do not know what militia are, they are basically part-time soldiers, civilian soldiers. These were individuals who would train maybe once or twice a month, sometimes less than that. And they basically were designed to defend their state or their city, town, or village, because every town, city, and village in the United States would have a small militia. Now, militiamen, they all had their own different uniforms. You can look in the image that they're all kind of wearing their own uniforms. They're not a lot of uniformity there. Some of them were more fancy than others, depending on which unit it was. Oftentimes, these militia units, were kind of seen as social clubs for men. So sometimes these were more just for not for military purposes, but for a chance just to kind of hang out and advance yourself socially. These militia were oftentimes not particularly liked by the regular army. In fact, William T. Sherman, very famous Civil War general, would say that they were a pack of rascals who could not, basically not to be trusted. They couldn't be congregated together because they were just disorganized, they were ill-disciplined. One should also remember that a lot of these militiamen had elected their own officers, and these officers most of them had very little training. Sometimes they were just elected because of their popularity. But it should be stated, however, that not all of these militiamen or militia units were bad. Some of them were actually pretty dangerous, pretty well trained. And perhaps the best of the militia were militiamen from Tennessee. Tennessee militia were frontiersmen, and they were very experienced Indian fighters. And during this war, about 500 Tennessee militiamen would arrive in Florida in 1836, and they were led by a man by the name of William Lauderdale. Now, William Lauderdale, he of course is what Fort Lauderdale is named after. He was highly respected. He once served in the regular army and had fought in many different Indian campaigns. Now, Lauderdale himself, we don't know when exactly he was born. We just know that he was born sometime in the 1780s in Virginia. We know that in the 1790s, as a young man, he would move to Tennessee. When he moved to Tennessee, his family built a plantation there, and his neighbor was none other than Andrew Jackson. So Jackson was his neighbor, and Jackson and Lauderdale became very good friends. They would serve together in a number of campaigns. They both served in the Army. They both would fight in the Creek War and also in the Battle of New Orleans. Lauderdale would actually serve as Jackson's chief of staff, meaning that he was his top assistant. That's in military terminology. That's what a staff officer is. Lauderdale, after these wars, was semi-retired, but when the Seminole War began, Jackson called upon his old friend, his old comrade, to raise a militia to go fight in the Seminole War. Now, Lauderdale's first action would be at the Battle of Loxahatchee. The Battle of Loxahatchee, which is all the way down here, right at the very bottom of the screen, was fought where we now called the Jupiter Inlet, so in Palm Beach County. Now, the reason why the Army launched an attack here was because they were going after a Seminole leader by the name of Abiaka. So Abiaka's back in our story. Abiaka was there, and the Army, along with a large contingent of Marines, would attack. They would fail. Abiaka would escape, and he would retreat south to his home, which is in the Pine Island Ridge. And the Pine Island Ridge is in modern-day Broward County. So Jessup orders Lauderdale and about 200 Tennessee militia, as well as 50 U.S. Army regulars, to go in pursuit. They would march from Jupiter all the way down to Broward County. Along the way, they would build a trail. Now, this trail was initially known as Lauderdale's Trail, but eventually its name would change into Military Trail. And if you're somebody who lives in North Broward or Palm Beach County especially, you probably know this road. You probably have driven on this road. This road eventually kind of turns into Power Line Road. And so if you're a Fort Lauderdale resident, that's kind of how you know where Lauderdale's Trail is. So they actually turned this now into a modern day road. He would march on this trail for only a couple weeks. Amazingly enough, it didn't take him too long to get from Jupiter to Fort Lauderdale, or the New River. And when he arrives here on March 6, 1838, he would begin construction of our very first fort. Yeah, so the fort's finally in our story. Again, Lauderdale arrives here on March 6. He builds a fort that's had about a 60 to 50 foot square circumference. It had 7-foot tall poles that made up the barricade, and it had a 2-story blockhouse, which is kind of a large tower at the middle. So a relatively small fort, but also pretty strong as well. Now, we know a lot about this fort and what was going on here by the journal of a man named Robert Anderson. Again, if you're a Civil War buff, you might know that name because Robert Anderson would later gain fame for being the commanding officer at the Battle of Fort Sumter, which of course was the very first battle of the Civil War, which took place in Charleston Harbor. But at this time, Anderson is just a young lieutenant commanding the Army regulars with William Lauderdale. Now, why was the fort called Fort Lauderdale? Well, Army practice at that time was that whoever the commanding officer was of a building of a fort, the fort would be named after him. So Lauderdale was not egotistical or anything. That was just simply military practice at that time. Now, if we look at this nice little Google map that I made, kind of gives you an idea where this fort was located. It was located right at the forks of the New River. Lauderdale built it there because he wanted to keep an eye out on Seminole movement. The Seminoles would use the New River oftentimes to go to the ocean, to go fish and hunt out there, and then go out into the Everglades. The New River was a river that could go out to the Everglades. He also knew that the Seminoles relied on a lot of coontie plants, and coontie plants were growing quite well in that area. So again, that was another strategy that the Army would use, is that they would actually destroy coontie plants because they knew the Seminoles needed it. Now, the fort's completed on March 16th, and then about a week afterwards, on March 22nd, Lauderdale is reinforced with Marines and sailors, and he now has a relatively large force of about 500 men. And he, along with a new Army commander by the name of Colonel Bankhead, would launch an attack on Abiaka and his settlement. Now, before we talk about this little battle, let's talk a little bit about Abiaka himself. He was also known as Sam Jones to the Americans. That was his American name, but his Seminole name was Abiaka. Abiaka was actually not really a chief, but a medicine man, so a spiritual leader. And he was sort of seen as after Osceola, kind of seen as the leader of the Seminole resistance against the government. In fact, when Osceola was captured in 1837, Abiaka was now seen as sort of the leader of the Seminole resistance movement. So this made the Army wanting to capture him even more important. Abiaka was probably in his 50s and 60s by this point, and he was known to be very, very clever. He was very hard to capture. Loxahatchee wasn't the first time, and this wouldn't be the last time either that the Army would try to capture him and Abiaka would escape. But anyways, on March 22nd, the Army, Navy, and Marines launched their attack. They are on boats. They would basically paddle their way to the Pine Island Ridge. And for those who do not know where the Pine Island Ridge is, it's in now modern-day Davie, the site of where his settlement, most likely Abiaka's settlement, was in what's now known as Tree Tops Park, where there's actually a monument for him out there. The Army would go from here. You can see where the blue is where the fort is, and took them about a day to get there, and they would launch their attack. Now, the battle itself was not much of a battle. It was very brief. Only a few shots were fired. We know that only one soldier was slightly wounded. And as for the Seminoles, we don't think the Seminoles sustained any casualties. The Seminoles saw the Army coming miles away, and they had actually retreated further into the Everglades. So the mission was overall a failure. Well, before we talk about the second fort, we should talk a little bit briefly what happened to Lauderdale afterwards. The first fort itself was eventually abandoned by late 1838. By late 1838, the Army had felt that the Seminoles in the area had since moved away. They felt that there was no reason to have a fort there, and Lauderdale himself would leave. And Lauderdale, who himself was an older man, he was in his 50s, was suffering from disease that he caught while serving on campaign. And a few months after leaving Fort Lauderdale, he would actually die of these disease complications in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So our city's namesake really did not have a good time while stationed here in Fort Lauderdale. Now, the Army was mistaken in the fact that the Seminoles were gone. The Seminoles would actually return to Fort Lauderdale once more, and they would again launch raids in this area, particularly along the coastline. So in 1839, the Army begins construction of a second fort. Now, this fort was relatively small. It was mostly just a small fence and tents. The Army was only really using this second fort as a brief station for the construction of a larger fort that we'll talk about, which is the third fort. Excuse me. This second fort, again, was mostly a campsite. It had a watchtower and one small blockhouse. But where was this fort located? Interestingly enough, this fort was actually pretty close to where Stranahan House today is. Yeah, so if we look in this map, the green is Stranahan House, the red is the fort. It was located around the Tarpon Springs area, and it's actually close to a modern-day apartment complex, Riverside Apartments, next to a water taxi stop. Sadly, there's no marker stating where this fort is. The first and third fort do, but the second fort does not have a historical marker. Again, and this is only a couple blocks from where I'm sitting right now, and I actually have walked there, and it was on the north side of the New River. But again, the fort, which was the second fort, which was built in February, was abandoned in October of 1839, because in October of 1839, a much larger third fort was completed. This third fort, which was built right along the coastline and the intercoastal, was pretty impressive. It had 3 two-story blockhouses, which you can see on these images, a 10-foot barricade, which is the walls. These were usually made up of local trees, particularly cypress or pine trees. It had a wooden officer and soldier barracks, and even a little medical barracks as well. So pretty, as far as military forts go, pretty comfortable, pretty nice. Although I'm sure if you were a soldier there, you were probably not too fond of it. Speaking of which, before we talk about that, let's just again show you where the third fort is. Basically located where Bahia Mar is on Fort Lauderdale Beach. Its location's now currently the parking lot of Bahia Mar, and it's close to where the Jungle Queen actually docks as well. And there is a historical marker located where the third fort is. And this fort would be the longest serving of the three forts of Fort Lauderdale. And again, here the green is where Stranahan House is, so it's about a 2-mile drive or walk from where we are sitting at the moment. Now, much of what we know about the fort, well, the second and third fort, comes from a doctor by the name of Ellis Hughes. He was the fort's doctor at this time. He was a bit of an amateur artist. He drew a number of sketches of life in the Fort Lauderdale, and he also even met Abiaka. So this is his sketch of Abiaka. Interestingly enough, in 1839, there was a brief truce between the Army and the Seminoles, and Abiaka and the Seminoles would actually trade with soldiers in the fort for food and supplies. Sadly, this truce would end in 1840. But it's kind of interesting to think that during this conflict, there was a brief period of peace where the Seminoles and the soldiers would actually work together. Now, Hughes, even though he gives us a lot of great details about what life was like at the fort, he hated serving at Fort Lauderdale. Duty was very boring at the fort. There were no towns, no settlements. You were isolated. And really, if you were someone who was not happy about it, he, like a lot of soldiers, he would give in to drink. And Hughes was stated to have been drunk most of the time while on duty. He would disobey officers. He would bully other soldiers, just to be overall insubordinate. And in 1840, he was given charged with 8 different types of charges, which eventually will almost lead to him being court-martialed. Eventually, the Army decided just to come up with a plea. They just gave him an honorable discharge if he would just leave the Army. But as you can see, these were some charges put upon Dr. Hughes. So some of them are kind of they're kind of interesting, but it gives you an idea, again, what life was like at this fort. And again, what was life like for a soldier? Well, I mentioned it was pretty boring, as you see in the image here. Oftentimes soldiers would give in to drink and alcohol. And also, it could also be pretty dangerous for your health. Remember, South Florida has a lot of mosquitoes, and there were a lot more back then in this time period. And a lot of soldiers would catch tropical diseases, particularly malaria. And so, in fact, most of the soldiers who fought in the Seminole War would die because of disease, more so than enemy bullets. But also the enemy was certainly a fear too as well. Every so often the soldiers would go on patrol and they would be shot at or attacked by the Seminoles as well. So there was a fear of battle that the soldiers had to deal with. But it wasn't all bad. Soldiers would find ways to entertain themselves. After all, they were stationed on the beach, so a lot of soldiers would, of course, do what modern-day Floridians and tourists do. They would just swim in the waters of the ocean. They would also go hunting and fishing. That was another popular pastime if you were a soldier stationed in Fort Lauderdale. Now, quite a few famous individuals that would fight in the Civil War served at this fort. I'm going to kind of break it down by Union and Confederate. On the Confederate side, we had men like Joseph E. Johnson and John B. Magruder. Joseph E. Johnson, he is a pretty important Confederate general during the Civil War. In fact, he was the 3rd highest ranked general in their army. He would actually be the last Confederate general to surrender to the Union in 1865 east of the Mississippi River. So he was a pretty prominent general. And John B. Magruder, he was the commander of Confederate forces in Texas during the Civil War. There was a lot more famous Union officers that would serve in the Fort Lauderdale. Men like George H. Thomas, who fame was leading a very prominent defense at the Battle of Chickamauga, the second bloodiest battle in the Civil War. He became known as the Rock of Chickamauga in that conflict. William S. Harney, who, although did not fight very much in the Civil War, he was famous for being a very successful Native American Indian fighter. And in fact, he was considered the most successful fighter against the Seminoles during the Second Seminole War, and he was stationed at Fort Lauderdale in 1839. But perhaps the most famous future Civil War officer and general to serve in Fort Lauderdale would be William T. Sherman, who was stationed at the fort in 1840. Very briefly, he was only there for about a month, and maybe because he was only there for a month, he seems to be the only soldier or officer who actually had positive things to say about serving in Fort Lauderdale. Probably helped that he was serving during the winter months, which again are a lot nicer than serving in the summer months here in South Florida. So the reason why I bring these soldiers up, is that I think it's kind of interesting that for a lot of these future Civil War generals, they were all young officers. Remember, this war was fought in the 1830s and 40s, and the Civil War was fought in the 1860s. So for many of these men, such as William T. Sherman, this was their first combat, their first duty. They were all young officers, lieutenants, and captains. And many of them would take the skills they learned from the Seminole Wars into their later careers as Civil War generals. Again, life in Fort Lauderdale could be dangerous. We know this is not the complete list of soldiers who died serving at the fort. We don't have the list of the militiamen who would die here, but we do know of the Army regulars, and about 14 of them did die while serving in Fort Lauderdale. Most of them were not by enemy bullets. In fact, only 3 were actually 4, were killed by Native American by battles with the Seminoles, but most of them would die because of disease. You'll see that some of them say diarrhea. This is mostly due to malaria that again was very rampant at this time. Some of them even drowned on duty as well, and one of them was believed to be a suicide too. So again, very tough existence to be a soldier stationed in Florida. And a lot of soldiers, especially as the war was continuing on, were not particularly happy to be stationed down here. This was kind of seen as not a good posting. And honestly, the war itself was starting to lose popularity in the rest of the country. Remember, this war started in 1835, and as 1842, it was still going on. And in fact, the Seminole War would be financially the costliest Native American war in American history, and also the deadliest too. And just like any long war, U.S. citizens were starting to ask themselves, why are we paying all this money to fight this conflict, to fight this war? And for what? For Florida, a place filled with swamps and alligators and mosquitoes? What's the point of it? And many people were also starting to lose interest in removing the Seminoles. And because you got to remember, by 1842, Andrew Jackson's no longer the president of the United States. So, and also a new political party, the Whigs, had taken over at this point too. So they were kind of not interested in continuing what they felt was a war of the previous administration. So if we look, the war would end in 1842 with not the signing of a treaty, but sort of an unofficial understanding. The Army gave the Seminoles an unofficial reservation in Southwest Florida, basically kind of where Fort Myers and Naples is today. The Seminoles who were living in this little reservation were only about 300, because sadly, during the course of this war, most of the Seminoles were removed to Oklahoma. It is believed that prior to the war, there were about 5,000 Seminoles living in Florida, and about 3,824 were sent to Oklahoma, and the rest would die because of battle and disease and even starvation as well, which is very sad. As for the U.S. military, well, we had about 10,000 Army regulars, Marine sailors, as well as 30,000 militia serving, which again, for a Native American war, that's a lot of soldiers. These wars usually did not have such large troop numbers, but the Seminole War certainly did. And in terms of the cost of war, 355 soldiers were killed in action, with much more dying of disease. We don't know how many civilians would die in this conflict, but it is believed to be in maybe the hundreds, most likely. Overall, the war itself would cost about $40 million, which is definitely in the almost the billions in today's money. So after the Second Seminole War ended, the forts at Fort Lauderdale were abandoned. The third fort was abandoned in 1842, basically left to rot. The And it was kind of seen that it would be peace, and Fort Lauderdale would just become a quiet piece of land like it once was. But war would break out again about a decade later in 1855. The remaining Seminoles were being led by a man named Billy Bowlegs, and once again, conflict with settlers would erupt into a third conflict called the Third Seminole War. This war would last from 1855 to 1858. It did not really involve Fort Lauderdale, so I won't talk too much about it, but Fort Lauderdale does kind of play a role, though. In this conflict, the Army would build a fort in Miami called Fort Dallas. That fort is actually slightly remaining even today. You can actually see the barracks of this fort in downtown Miami. And this fort was kind of used as the base of operations for operations against the Seminoles in southeast Florida. And during this period of time, the Army would send a young officer by the name of Abner Doubleday. Now, if you are a fan of baseball and know baseball history, Abner Doubleday is the man who supposedly created baseball. Probably did not, but legend has it that he did create baseball. Now, Doubleday, he was tasked to build a new road that would link Miami to modern-day Jupiter, because there was the other fort up there as well. He would pass by the New River, and he would state that he would see the remains of Fort Lauderdale. Now, interestingly enough, that road that he would build would eventually be used by later road builders in the late 1890s and early 20th century. And this is important to Stranahan history because that's the road that would bring Frank Stranahan here to Fort Lauderdale. That war would end with Billy Bowlegs and his band of Seminoles being sent to Oklahoma. And by this point, now there was less than 100 Seminoles living in Florida, and that last band of Seminoles were being led by none other than Abiaka. So Abiaka is the sort of the last man standing when it comes to the Florida Seminole. So what happened to the forts? Like I said, the forts were made out of wood. Wood does rot very quickly, especially in warm southern climates, tropical climates. And none of them stand today. None of them exist anymore. And the only remains that we really have of these forts comes from archaeology. Fort Lauderdale and archaeologists have been uncovering remains of artifacts such as bullets, buttons, tobacco pipes, belt buckles, a little bit of everything. And these are kind of the last remnants of these forts, and many of them are found in museums such as the Fort Lauderdale History Museum. And what is the legacy of this war when it comes to Broward County? Well, like again, the Seminoles, the legacy for them was that it was Abiaka's band that survived. And Abiaka's band, they lived in Broward County. They would once again move back to the Pine Island Ridge amongst other settlements, and they would remain. And because they never signed a treaty and never left, they, to this day, call themselves the Unconquered because, again, they were not defeated. Abiaka and his followers remain. And in the 1970s, a statue was built for Abiaka at the Treetops Park. And there's also a copy at the Seminole Reservation in Big Cypress. Around the same time, a statue was also built for William Lauderdale. It's not located in Fort Lauderdale, but it is located in the Forest Ridge community next to Treetops Park. In that statue, you'll notice that Lauderdale looks disheveled and defeated, because by the time that battle was fought, he was very sickly from his fighting of the Seminole. Now, after these wars, Fort Lauderdale would not see much habitation, not much settlement, but in 1893, a young man from Ohio named Frank Stranahan would arrive here on the New River. And when he arrived, on his very first day, he would encounter the Seminoles. But this encounter would not be hostile. In fact, it would actually be very friendly. And very quickly, Frank Stranahan would build a very strong business, but also relationship of friendship with the Seminoles. And to this day, that relationship would grow, and eventually the Seminoles themselves would become part, and with our growing South Florida community. Today, there are about a couple thousand Seminoles living in Florida, and they still remain here in South Florida to this day, as does the Stranahan House. So that concludes our first of our lecture series today. Again, the Seminole Wars are a very fascinating topic, and I wish I could do a whole program just on the Seminole War itself. But I think I gave you guys a pretty good introduction to it. I certainly gave you a lot of information about the forts at Fort Lauderdale. If you wish to learn more, I definitely recommend you visit museums. The Fort Lauderdale History Museum has artifacts, as do many of our local libraries. I, of course, would be happy to answer as well. I do reenact Seminole War battles. So if you have any questions for me, definitely email me at education@historicstranahanhouse.org. And you can also ask questions on the Facebook posts here as well. I'll do my best to answer these questions that you have. So next week we will have our weekday programming. Monday we're going to be doing a program on what life was like to be a child in Pioneer, South Florida at the turn of the 20th century. We'll be continuing our virtual reality tours as well, amongst a few other different interesting programs. So with that being said, thank you all for joining me today at Historic Stranahan House Museum, and I wish you all a wonderful, happy, and safe day. Thank you.